any other field, always room for improvement, but it is not something that we are not taking, as I said, seriously. I need also to say that we cannot take for granted that those individuals came to Canada with criminal backgrounds. Maybe it is sometimes the situation, but we cannot take for granted that it is always the situation. And, you know, doing a good screening also involves having a very good partnership and relation with the country of origin, as we need to also rely on their own information. So those are the information that I want, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
No, that's okay. I mean, would you rely on a police record check from India in doing screening? I would think that there may be security concerns with doing that.
So we never 100% rely, for sure, but it is an important input, but we need to do all separate also monitoring.
Probably better directed at the IRCC, but Commissioner Duhem, I had a question for you. You had mentioned that the RCMP brought this issue to the government, and I wondered if you could just quickly clear up. There have been allegations that the Prime Minister directed you to go public on Thanksgiving Monday. Was that the case?
No, it wasn't the case. And I've shared earlier that we never actually pinpoint October 14th as that date. We knew that we wanted to come proactively, but then when you look at the efforts that Mme. Duhem and Mr. Morrison took in Singapore, the lack of engagement by Indian officials with our Deputy Commissioner Flynn, the leaks to the media, the fact that they didn't want to talk to us on Monday, October 14th, we said there's no sense of delaying this. Let's go out right away to inform the Canadian public.
One of the things that our study is looking at is the misinformation and disinformation that's being put out by the government of India. And I'm wondering if you can maybe, I'm not sure who is best placed for this, maybe CSIS, or I'll let you decide. Talk about the disinformation campaign that's going on now and the impact that it can have on Canadians because of the information that they're putting out.
Obviously, really important issue, misinformation, not just from a state of India, but there are a number of states that we are concerned about how dis and misinformation might be affecting Canadians. I think colleagues will be aware that we have established a counter foreign interference coordinator at Public Safety. And in addition to some of my colleagues earlier have spoken about engagement and outreach being a really core component of that, also understanding mis and disinformation and deliberating on how we can best provide information to Canadians that counteracts that dis and misinformation, identifies it, calls it out when we see it happening. This is an area of significant effort on behalf of public safety right now.
Thank you. And Chair, I'd just like to read this notice of motion, and I don't want to do anything with it today, that the committee summon Liam Donovan and Lauren Southern to testify on their own for no less than 2 hours on their participation in Russian-backed interference and far-right disinformation campaigns intended to manipulate the Canadian public, and that they appear before November 29th. So I'm just giving notice of that today. I only have 30 seconds left. I wonder if you might be able to give us some examples of the type of disinformation that India is engaged in on this particular issue.
Well, maybe I can go back to what I've said before. India spread that we have not shared with them any evidence. And they also spread that the fact that we do have violence in Canada is because we are not taking extreme violence seriously.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We go now to Ms. Michaud. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît. 2 minutes and demi, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The special report by the Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Interference indicated that after China, India is the one that has the most interference in Canadian institutions. Apparently there are activities that go beyond pro-Khalistan demands expressed in Canadian society, interference in Canadian institutions, targeting Canadian politicians, and media, ethno-Indian institutions, and so on. So we have evidence that there is a person in Canada who might be in danger. You meet with that person. So I was going to ask you, what can you offer that person in terms of protection? Can the RCMP offer protection to those people? And that leads me to another question. Do you only meet the people whose lives are in danger, or do you also meet those who might be suspected of participating in foreign interference? Sometimes, if you're talking about politicians, there might be people who participated without even noticing it. Somebody who goes on a parliamentary mission abroad and has a drink with a colleague from another country, shares information about Canada without realizing that this is privileged information. Do you do that kind of meeting too with people that you think may have cooperated with India in this case? Or is it just people whose lives are in danger? Because there's this whole debate about the names that the Prime Minister mentioned. The leader of the opposition doesn't want to get the security clearance to warn these people. Is it the leader of the opposition who could warn them, or are you in a position to warn people who may be implied in foreign interference? Sorry about my long question. When it comes to the duty to warn people whose lives are in danger, the role of the RCMP is not only to provide them with protection, but tell them about the credible and imminent threat. We would offer the person certain suggestions on maybe not follow the same routine every day, educate them about cybersecurity. There's no cookie-cutter approach for each case. We try to educate people to change their habits. The other question I would say you should put to their service, because what you're saying right now, the RCMP will get involved in foreign interference when there's criminal activity. But beyond that, if there's intelligence that's being shared, because so-and-so met with so-and-so, I think that CSIS would be in a better position to meet with that person. If there's any time left, I would ask Mr. Rogers to answer. We have these kinds of meetings
many times over the last number of years. And we also, just to add to what the Commissioner said, we've done that with partners and community groups, not just individuals, but where we see that there might be groups of individuals that could be the targets of a particular government's foreign interference strategy. With Public Safety Canada, the RCMP and others, we can engage them.
Merci, Madame.
when it comes to discussions with elected officials. Sometimes they're not always aware. We have a more global issue of the strategy. It's important to warn them when we know something. Thank you.
Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, maybe I'll turn a question to the Department of Public Safety because the RCMP, CBSA, and CSIS all operate under your ministry's wheelhouse. And this committee has been looking at a previous issue of how a couple of Egyptian nationals were able to come into Canada, and there was that foiled plot in Toronto, which was thankfully stopped before it could be executed. But we now have a situation where, a foreign government is actively collaborating with a criminal element named the Bishnoi gang. And I guess, I know that your department is still doing some internal investigations about, how did IRCC and CBSA coordinate and what went wrong. But what are some of the added challenges when a foreign government is working with a criminal activity? And is that informing how your department is having to look at maybe some of the people who might be coming from India? We don't want to put anyone under the spotlight, but we have a previous experience where someone did get in who shouldn't have been here. Just wondering if you can comment on that.
Sure. The short answer
If the question is are we in a process of continuous review and understanding how these threats need to be properly identified through our security screening process? The short answer is yes. You properly referenced that IRCC and we are engaged in a bit of a lessons learned exercise to ensure we have a really good understanding of some recent cases. And part of that process, though, will involve looking at other recent cases, looking at other threat actors, and how can we ensure that whilst no system is ever going to be perfect, that the system is as robust as it possibly can be. So we're engaged in that process right now. I wouldn't say that it's new. This is a continuous engagement that we're undertaking with IRCC, and as you pointed out, with all the agencies that report to the Department of Public Safety.
And very, very quickly, Commissioner Duhem, just from the RCMP's perspectives, I mean, you know, a lot of collaboration is required amongst various police forces around the world. What are some of the added challenges that you're now experiencing with the involvement of the Bishnoi gang?
Well, we had good working relationships with the Indian National Investigation Agency. They were actually here in Canada over the years to understand our judicial process, and we also sent a team over there. And obviously, with what happened, we have to rebuild those relationships because we do have things in common. When I think of violent extremists, it's not only happening here in Canada, but it's also happening in India. So there are common interests there, and we want to renew those relationships so we can work together for a common cause.
Mr. McGregor. We go now to Mr. Motz for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for being here, witnesses. And Commissioner, I specifically want to thank you for the work that you and your members have done on this file. That you didn't give it up 11 months ago and longer. And thank you for the work that you've done and bringing this as far as you have. And I wish you the best in continuing to work on it. I do have a question. When you're dealing with sensitive national security information, not necessarily you, Commissioner, maybe this is more Mr. Wan, when you're dealing with national security, sensitive national security information, who can declassify that? Who has the authority to do that?
The owner of the intelligence products. So, for example, let's say you have something that have been published or released.
That's the standard in the intel world. The owner can release it. Now you are a consumer of that. You don't create your own intel. You're as the national security intelligence advisor to the PM. You're the consumer of intelligence, right?
Right.
So who did you get to authorize the release? You don't call it sensitive information or it was classified. But I mean, I read the National Post article. I'm telling you what. That's pretty sensitive information, pretty classified information. So someone above you, who the owner of that intel had to give you authority to release that to the Washington Post, did you not?
So as I said many times, we have not shared classified information with the journalists. Maybe I can add that what we discussed with the journalists was exactly what we told all your leaders when we briefed.
Mr. Poilievre. Thank you. And again, I don't want to play semantics, but I mean, I would consider some of the information that you told was not made public, would not normally have been made public under different circumstances. Commissioner Duhaime has made that very, very clear. It could impact the criminal investigation and jeopardize the lives of many individuals. Commissioner, you stated very recently, I don't know the exact time, but within the last week or so, that you would have concerns if the 6 diplomats were to be replaced. Does that remain your position?
Yeah, my comment was that I do have concerns considering how the government of India operates, but I also shared in that same interview that I'm not familiar with the background process that's in place when a diplomat or a consular official is appointed to a country. So perhaps Mr. Security side or checks.
I was just going to ask Mr. Morrison, do you share those same concerns, and what does that look like for global affairs?
We will continue to let the dust settle, and then there's a lot of dust, and then we will work with our counterparts to ensure that both sides have adequate representation in each other's countries. There's a process of screening where when a country applies to accredit its diplomats, we work as Global Affairs Canada with the security agencies to ensure there's no adverse information. And assuming that's the case, then we accredit new diplomats.
Thank you. And quickly, Commissioner, you had mentioned here just a couple minutes ago about it's reasonable to assume, in fact, it's occurring, that India also experiences violent extremism, differently than we do here. You indicated that that's a reality. Now, is it possible that criminals from Canada are giving direction to operas in India, just like it's alleged to be vice versa to Canada?
I mean, after coming out on October 14th, anything's possible. We can't discount that, but that's the importance of working with our colleagues in India so we can work together and address the people who are involved.
Thank you. 5 minutes.
So much. Okay, we go now to Ms. O'Connell for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I have to say, I'm quite concerned, and following on my colleague Mr. Sarai's comments, we're here at about just over an hour and a half into testimony, about 5 rounds of questions for the Conservatives. I think at least 3 of those rounds were focused on information that was done on background to the media that have confirmed that that information was not classified by the sheer fact that their own leader received the same information, and we all know he doesn't have a security clearance. So information that was provided by all leaders was also provided to the media, and Conservatives have spent at least 3 of their rounds on that issue, information that their party already had. And then what we just heard from Mr. Motz, instead of, to Mr. Sarai's point about the very real threat to community members, and I can only imagine how it felt and feels hearing these reports. Conservatives just spent a round asking about Canadian criminals in India, and not a single question about the fact that the Indian government worked with organized crime, and this is what is being alleged in the media, worked with organized crime to target Canadians with violence. There's a murder investigation. There are other investigations ongoing, and not a single question from the Conservative Party about how that might impact our community here in Canada. And to actually ask that question in terms of Canadian criminals abroad, I would think Canadians across this country, in particular in the Sikh community, the Indo-Canadian community, must find very cold comfort in what we just saw. And I don't know how to continue to not call that out for what it is. And I just think that Canadians deserve better. And so I thank all of you for being here to try and shed some of this light. We have our top security officials here for almost 2 hours, and that's the quality of question we got. I have to look at it from the community's perspective, and I'm quite disappointed that that's how that time was spent. But that is for Conservatives to answer to constituents across this country of why they would rather stand up or not call out the alleged actions of the Indian government that has been widely reported. So with that being said, I wanted to speak to Madame Drouin in terms of the sharing of that information with media. You mentioned, which was not brought up in the 3 panels of questions obsessing over that instead of safety of Canadians, but the fact that those reporters and the journalists had other sources, and that had Canadian representatives and officials not responded, that potentially the Canadian side of things, understanding that we're dealing with a lot of misinformation, would have been left unchecked? Was that part of the strategy to also ensure that information the Conservative Party already had was also shared with journalists to make sure that misinformation couldn't go unchecked?
So you're right that the strategy of using an international media outlet was to make sure that based on what I've talked earlier, misinformation from India, repeating that Canadian media are part of the Canadian strategy, using the India violence as a political mean to achieve our goals. So the idea of using an international media outlet was to make sure that the information will be widely spread and that our side of the story will be bring correctly.
Thank you. Commissioner Duhem or anyone else that'd like to comment on this. The question about the Indian government potentially, and my colleague Mr. Gahir spoke about the reference to a Bollywood plot, but the idea that perhaps the Indian government was using organized crime criminals within their country, within even their own criminal justice systems, Canada would not have been able to reach in and, let's say, arrest that individual to disrupt that. So is part of the reason for coming forward publicly was these sorts of serious allegations and actions in areas that the police in Canada could not just in a traditional sense go and follow where the investigation leads and go pick up an individual or a criminal that may not be within our borders.
Quick answer, please.
Priority for us was public safety.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. We'll start our fourth round now with Mr. Shipley. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Mrs. for being here today. I'd just like I lost track, maybe 4, 5, 6, 9 times. My friend was keeping track in her opening question, so I think the people who are being overly partisan are perhaps on the other side of the table today. But anyways, we've got a serious issue ahead of us. They can smirk, they can laugh, but let's get into some of the questions here. First to Mr. Morrison and Mr. Ruan. An NSCOP report from 2019 stated that CSIS observed an increase in Indian threat-related activity targeting the Indo-Canadian, diaspora and government institutions. This same NSCOP report found that Indian consular officials were maintaining blacklists of dissidents, controlling travel visas to India, and recruiting community sources that were engaging MPs and political candidates to advance Indian objectives. Given that each of your organizations presumably read this report at the time and knew about these activities dating back to at least 2019, which very clearly fall outside of the norm of diplomatic activity, why did the government wait until these threats had escalated to the point of violence and murder to expel any consular officials?
I think as Natalie said and has been testified to today, the various parts of the government have been live to the issue of foreign interference for a number of years and have been taking all kinds of measures when the situation reached its apex, as has been described, and as the RCMP has said, when they came to us and sought our help, we then used one of our heaviest diplomatic tools, which was the persona non grata tool. But I wouldn't assume that Indian foreign interference was not a constant subject of discussion throughout that time period, 2019 until the present, in all of our interactions with India.
Mr. L'Inde
India is also a priority for the work of the service. So when it comes to the resources we deploy to identify various strategies by India, that's one of the countries we concentrate on more.
To Mr. Duham, thank you for being here today. Through a lot of the reports we've read and a lot of the indications that a lot of this crime that we're talking about is going on here is being funneled through organized crime groups that are here in Canada. What have we done, or what have you done, or what have your group or the government done to disrupt the communication lines between organized crime groups and the Indian government to ensure this doesn't continue?
Well, the fact, Mr. Chair, that we came out publicly, that was one of the strategies we had to ensure that the message is out and that the community is aware and the community will report it, making sure that people from the community do not fall victims to influence and whatnot. And it's continuing to work with our government departments as to maintaining not oversight, but a view of what's going on in Canada with regards to Government of India's influence on criminal activities in Canada.
Thank you for that. And I have a quick question. I've really been intrigued today by Mr. Morrison and Mr. Nguyen. I'm going to quote your words back to both of you. You have both said that you've decided to go to the Washington Post to make sure you went to a respected and credible newspaper. By that, do you feel there are no respected or credible newspapers in Canada?
Go back to, I think we said international outlets, sir. And this is a very
you did
important.
say you wanted to go to a respected and credible news source, and you used the Washington Post.
I think I explained that, and that has nothing to do, quite the contrary. And I also said in my opening remarks that the pretension of India are not right, but they pretend that our India file is politically motivated, and that our media are into that scheme too. So this is why we use an international outlet, because we knew that those allegations from India would resurface. So that was the nexus and the reason to go with an international outlet.
Thank you, Mr. Shipley. We'll go now to Mr. Dollarwell for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, over the past, many weeks, my constituents have come to me, and in fact, they have appreciated the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and also thanked the RCMP, Commissioner Duham, and also Mr. Rogers, the work that CISA has done, and community feels at ease. But on the other hand, they keep on complaining to me about the Conservatives and their leader, particularly when even today I can see their line of questioning is not focusing on the perpetrators of crime, which is agents of India. In fact, is questioning you and all those media things. I'm coming back to Mr. Rogers here. I just need more clarification. Just to clarify an earlier point, that would the leader of the opposition still need a security clearance in order to read the NSI COP report and to learn about his own leadership race, because a lot of allegations coming that agents of India were involved to install him as a leader of the Conservative Party. Would he need a security clearance to know all that? And if you can elaborate that, please.
Apologies. Thank you for the question. I have to refrain from speaking to the specifics of any intelligence, so I have to go back to what I've said before, which is that we will be able to describe more and broader sets of intelligence to people with a security clearance. In cases where that clearance is not available, we will look at the other mechanisms available to us, which might include things like threat reduction measures, or other types of information briefings, defensive briefings, or other briefings to help reduce the threat that would apply with any opposition leader or any Canadian.
Basically, on the other side, the leaders of the opposition say that it's going to be the gag orders, from whoever. But would it make sense as a responsible leader to take that clearance and get all that information so that leader can protect or can play a role to protect Canadians in a better way?
What I would say is We at the service will be able to brief more, and Madame Drouin and others may speak to this also, because classified information doesn't uniquely come from the service. There is CSE and other agencies across government, to those who have a security clearance. And I think I have to leave it at that.
Madam Drouin, you want to add something? Thank you. And coming back to the RCMP, what lessons Commissioner, the RCMP has learned from these situations, and how will it prepare for similar scenarios not to happen in future, and the Canadian lives are safe and not at risk?
Yeah, in my press conference, I did say the exceptional circumstances. One of the lessons learned here is explore other tools. If public safety is at risk, explore other tools in order to disrupt. And this is exactly the NSIA as well as GAC to look at options, considering that the threshold for laying charges against a diplomat is fairly high, and the chance of prosecution sometimes is challenging. But considering there's an immediate public safety threat, we stepped outside and used the disruption method, which is not commonly used in the RCMP, but it's proven very well with the results that we've seen.
Dr. Rogers, I brought in a bill, private members motion M112, and then the government took an action to bring in Bill C70. You mentioned earlier how this Bill C70 will help to protect Canadians in future, the tools that you got.
Thank you for the question. There are a number of things in Bill C70 that could assist the service in dealing with foreign interference threats. I mentioned earlier that there is now a provision for us to be able to engage in resilience discussions and disclosures with people outside the federal government, and that's something we've been doing already. There are other provisions to allow things like production orders and preservation orders, which could assist our investigations. Importantly for us, there's a statutory review of our legislation, which will allow the service and its legislation to potentially keep pace with evolving technical threats. I think I can leave it at that. There are a number of other measures. Oh, I should say it also closed the gap in one of our investigative gaps, which had come to light recently, where CSIS was unable to collect information about a threat actor in Canada if that information resided outside of Canada. That could certainly be applied in a foreign interference context, and that was resolved with Bill C70 also.
Thank you, Mr. Dhaliwal. We go encore, Madame.
Once again, Ms. Michaud, please go ahead for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McGregor spoke about the relationship with our allies and what all this means to the situation with India. And Mr. Morrison, you were saying earlier that in the Washington Post article, you wanted to talk to your allies and send a message to counter the disinformation from India. So my first question is, why did you decide to talk to your allies through the media? Is it because you were targeting the public in allied countries? I imagine there were already conversations going on with the allies. And my second question, what does this mean for our relationship with other countries that engage in foreign interference in Canadian institutions? The fact that India doesn't want to cooperate, what does it indicate? Even though you said we're not in the same place at all with what we're experiencing with India, Russia, China. We're not at the same stage. Well, what does this mean for Canada's relationship with countries like China and Russia? Maybe Ms. Drouin or whoever is in a position to answer.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. With regard to the first part of your question about the allies, we did talk with our allies a lot before we went to Singapore.
Is not unique to Canada. We've mentioned the Five Eyes. I have mentioned that we did things in lockstep with our allies all the way through Singapore and when we returned to Singapore, and frankly since, because other countries are also talking to India. And I don't mind saying our media strategy continues as well, because there are various ways to send messages and to correct the record, because believe me, India is coming at us full force with their own narrative, which simply doesn't add up. So allies have been an important part of this from the beginning, as have strategic public communications.
Merci, Madame. We go now to Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You know, the whole subject of foreign interference, I mean, I've heard it from my couple of years at this committee. You know, we know the Iranian diaspora would have something to say about the government of Iran. I've heard from the Tibetan community about what the People's Republic of China is engaged in, and now, of course, the South Asian community with respect to the government of India. And you know, in my riding, I have a large South Asian population as well. I have the historic Temple of Paldi is in my riding of Cowichan, Malahat, Langford. And so I think, to an earlier point, the attention on the government of India is validating what many in that community have known for quite some time right now. And I think my questions will be both to Director Rogers and to Commissioner Duhem. I don't doubt for a second that the men and women in your respective agencies are going to work every day and treating this with utmost serious. But, you know, as a parliamentarian, it's also my job to hold you to account. And I can't escape the fact that in the most recent NSICOP report, they did label Canada as a low-risk, high-reward environment in which our foreign adversaries are able to operate. And I know sources have reported to CBC News that the clandestine Indian network is still largely in place. You might see some elements of that disappear and go more quiet. But I guess my question, maybe I'll start with you, Director Rogers, is, you know, how do we flip those terms around? And with the passage of Bill C-70, do you feel confident that we're now on a path towards making Canada a high-risk, low-reward environment to operate for our foreign adversaries?
I think that's a very important question. I think I would start by saying I think the extraordinary circumstances around these events and the fact that our CMP has gone public has demonstrated the seriousness with which we take the issue. And I have to imagine that that will set the tone, that this is not a permissive environment for the government of India to operate. And I think, and others, certainly. I mean, I think that this sets a very clear tone, that this is not something that would be accepted in Canada. You're absolutely right that the people within the service will be very diligently pursuing foreign interference from all countries who may seek to perpetrate it here in Canada, including India, China, and others.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Quick answer, sure, go ahead.
Again, tying it into our public media event on the 14th, it's about education. It's about letting people know that we're there, we want to work with them. Any criminal investigation, being a theft of bike or a fraud check, it starts with people coming forward talking to us. And I can appreciate that some of the communities are reticent to come and approach because of their experience with the police in their own in their own respective country. But we want people to come forward, and we want to educate people. And the other challenge that we sometimes face is all this is done in a clandestine manner. So until people come forward, or if information is given to us in which we can launch an investigation, we're unhappy. But we want people to make sure that we're there, and the message is that we are working with all departments, service. We work hand in hand with the service on many, many of the files.
Thank you. Ms. Dancho, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you to all the witnesses for being here. It is quite the panel that we have, the Commissioner of the RCMP, the National Security Advisor, the Director of CSIS, and 2 top-level Deputy Ministers for Public Safety and Global Affairs. I appreciate your time very much and your commitment to national security in this country. I have no doubt that you all work extremely hard to keep Canadians safe. And ultimately, of course, you all answer to the Prime Minister in some way or another. He is the head of our government. And you'll recall certainly in the 2015 when Mr. Trudeau first became Prime Minister, they released a document was released called Open and Accountable Government. I'm sure you're all familiar. It mentions in there that as the head of government, the Prime Minister has special responsibility for national security, federal, provincial, territorial relations, and the conduct of international affairs. Do you all agree that he is the head of our national security apparatus, the Prime Minister? Does anyone disagree with that? No. So the responsibility ultimately ends with him, as you have agreed. And we are in a circumstance here where multiple individuals, one for sure, and perhaps others, according to the Washington Post article, have been murdered through direct ties to the government of India. Quite an extraordinary situation on our hands. We also have a situation where we have a foreign interference inquiry with Justice Hogue, where the real center of that is that China has been interfering in multiple elections, looking to undermine our democracy. We have misinformation en masse from Russia. We have issues from Iran. We have issues from Pakistan, others. Canada, from my understanding, has never quite been in this type of, we'll call it a pickle, to put it blunt, to put it lightly, where so many adversaries and others who we thought were certainly friends are coming at Canada from all angles. Is there any other time in history you can point to Canada facing this many threats in this way domestically from foreign actors? Is there any other time in the last 2 generations, for example?
Si vous me permettez, peut-être ce que je peux dire, c'est que il est vrai.
What I could say is that it's true we have to take seriously any attempt at foreign interference. I think that some of us here stated that during the last election, elections were fair and were not marked by the consequences of foreign interference. As parliamentarians, you adopted Bill C-170.
But that wasn't specifically my question. I do appreciate your commentary in response to my commentary, but that was not directly answering my question. But I'll just put that aside for now. As actually our colleague from the NDP mentioned, the NCCOP report labeled Canada a low-risk, high-reward for foreign adversaries, in essence, to come to Canada and wreak havoc and cause a lot of crime and chaos and even death now from India, for example, as you've mentioned. And so my concern is that the leadership from the top, given the only individual ultimately responsible for national security, and we have death on our hands. We had 13 more individuals in peril. From an objective analysis, things are not going that well in Canada. I appreciate there's things that you've done that we'll never know, but we should be grateful for. I appreciate that very much. But the fact that there's individuals being murdered in Canada is beyond comprehension from a foreign government. I'm sure you would agree. From our perspective as the official opposition tasked with holding the Liberal government accountable, this is an abject failure to maintain national security. The fact that individuals have been murdered, the fact that there are communities in this country, the Sikh community, for example, that have felt incredibly vulnerable under the so-called leadership of the current Prime Minister. So I think that really is the reason we are here is because he has failed to maintain national security. The reason we have the national inquiry into foreign interference is because there's been a failure to maintain the integrity of our democracy in terms of its attacks from China. And the confidence that creates, the confidence issue that creates across Canada is deeply concerning in the message that sends to other adversaries that they could take advantage of our democratic process and our trusting nature. So I think that really needs to be underlined in the sense that you can only do what your limitations are, what the leadership of this country are. So I just wanted to underline that because I feel that there seems to be an obsession with members opposite with the opposition leader, when I wish that the Liberal members would apply that same energy to holding their own Prime Minister accountable for failing to stop the murders of a number of people in Canada from a foreign government, for failing to stop interference into our elections. That's really quite a frustrating matter that has happened under their watch as they've been part of the Liberal government. And so, Mr. Chair, I just conclude that, again, I thank you for your efforts, and I appreciate very much what you've done to protect Canadians and to fill the gaps for the lack of leadership from our Prime Minister to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dunshall. We go now to Mr. Sarai for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to remind those that are watching, or maybe the press that's here, or others that are paying attention to this, that this study is on, quote, electoral interference and criminal activities by agents of the government of India. but it seems to be only 3 parties are asking questions on this study, while one party is asking questions based on a new love affair with Canadian journalism. So it's pretty interesting that all of a sudden there's a big love affair with Canadian journalists over international journalists. So I'm pretty intrigued in that. I hope that goes further in terms of supporting journalism in Canada. My question is, part of this study focuses on disinformation tactics employed by the government of India, and I'm very pleased to hear that there is actually a media strategy employed on this file. Can somebody elaborate for me, what are the hallmarks of Indian disinformation with some examples?
Security Advisor has spoken a bit about some of the tactics that we've seen in this very particular case. I think what we have to say is that there is a deep concern that these activities are happening not just from one country but from multiple countries. One of the things we've talked a bit about today and need to continue to talk about is how do we ensure resilience of Canadians? How do we ensure that they are well informed about efforts to disinform or misinform them? There's more to be done in that space. That's an effort ongoing by the Department of Public Safety amongst other colleagues. We're well informed by the intelligence from the service, from the RCMP and the tactics that are being used. But right now what we really need to focus on is how do we increase resilience so that Canadians are able to detect that and able to make sure that they're not affected by it.
We have seen in the past, Canada even, I think, prohibit Russian broadcasters, Russian television, I believe, to work on Canadian networks because of that disinformation. And what I'm hearing from our diaspora and other members here as well is when they watch a lot of international news, unfortunately, they're watching a lot of the propaganda coming from that country. In particular, under this matter, they're hearing that India is actually only that Canada's harboring terrorists. They're only going after terrorists. They're actually justifying it, and it's saying that Canada is actually accepting terrorists and giving them a free rein. What are we doing to counter that narrative that's being spewed into Canadians? Because unfortunately, some diaspora populations watch international news more than Canadian broadcasters.
3 parts of the strategy. One, we've talked a bit about some of the media strategy that we've employed recently. We at Public Safety are working very closely with colleagues at the Department of Heritage who also have engagement with the CRT, amongst others, in terms of how do we manage that at the macro level? How do we deal with some of the outlets that are propagating that dis and misinformation? So there's work to be done there. We also spoke about direct engagement with Canadians, though. I think that some of the outreach, the engagement, the trust confidence that we're talking about, all of that is also going to have significant impacts in terms of making sure that Canadians understand when they are being affected by dis and misinformation. So,
thank you. Mr. Rogers, as we've seen in the U.S. indictments against Vikash Yadav and Nikhil Gupta, Indian foreign interference and transnational repression is not isolated to Canada. What work is CSIS doing to engage with our American and other Five Eyes partners to disrupt Indian transnational repression?
Thank you for the question. So as Mr. Morrison said earlier, we are working very closely with our allies, and this includes intelligence sharing. CSIS will share intelligence that it has about India's tactics here in Canada. We will compare that with the intelligence we have around from our allies, and we'll work together to identify and further techniques that we can use to disrupt those activities. I think intelligence sharing is a start. I also think it's important that CSIS continue to build relationships with segments of society who can help us to inform us about what they're experiencing, and that we can provide guidance where possible. And I know that's something we'll also do in accordance with our Five Eyes allies.
And reporting on India's involvement in criminality and transnational repression has focused on India's external spy agency, the Research and Analysis Wing, RAW. What can CSIS tell the committee about how the Research and Analysis Wing functions, and particularly here in Canada?
I don't think I can speak to the specifics of that in this case, particularly as a number of the elements of that would be linked to RCMP's investigation. I can say that CSIS has had a relationship with RAW, and I think that we have said publicly before that we've seen that Indian proxies in Canada working at the behest of the government of India can do that with India's intelligence apparatus both here and abroad, but I'll limit my comments to that for today.
Lastly, just in closing, Mr. I don't know about my time, but Mr. Duham, Can the RCMP advise what Canadian Sikhs can do to keep themselves safe in Canada and secure in times where they feel they are at major risk, even going to a place of worship and praying or participating in any activities that they feel are lawfully allowed in Canada? What measures can they take, and how can they work with your office?
To what I said previously, if you see it, you hear it, report it. Make sure that we're involved early on, and we want to continue the engagement with the different communities to build that relationship so there's a free flow of information with police and the community.
Mr. Sarai. And thank you all for being here today and for all of your excellent testimony. And no doubt we will be in contact with all of you at some point down the road as well. So thank you very much. We are adjourned.